One of the things we often have to do when we create a web page is to display a list of items. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about things like you might find, on a BuzzFeed thing, top 5 movies to see this summer. No, I'm talking about just a little bit more straightforward list. Maybe you're building a recipe page and you need to list out the ingredients, or maybe you're listing a how-to type of page. You need to list the steps that you need to go through in order for someone to maybe do anything from send a return back to your store, request a refund, etc., etc. Okay, so I want to show you just a real simple type of list. And in HTML, we actually have 3 different types of lists. Now, you're going to find that 2 are very common. And the third is a lot less common, and I'm going to talk about when you're going to use them. We're also going to talk about how to use style each of these lists as we talk about the different lists. So let's start with what's probably the most common list, which is called an unordered list. An unordered list is simply a list where the order of the elements does not matter. So if you think about it, maybe you're packing for a trip. You have a list of everything that you want to include. It doesn't matter what the order is. You just need to check off that, yes, you have all those different items before you go out on your trip. So let's show you how to build that real quick. I have my open template. And remember, this is where we start from. I'm just going to do File, Save As, and I'm going to call this one Sample Unordered. Of course, the name is completely up to you. Inside of our main, you know what? We're going to go ahead and create a simple article. And then that's just for organization purposes. Remember, we don't have to have it. And now I'm going to create my list. Now, often my list will be after a series of paragraphs, or maybe a heading that says, ingredients to make sure you have, or tools that you'll need to use, or something like that. We're going to skip that part. We're going to focus on the list. And to create an unordered list, we're just going to use the open tag UL, and then we're going to close that tag. So the UL is short for unordered list, and that's all we have to do. We have created the tag for the list. I'm going to save this. I'm going to load my page here, and notice though, however, 2 quick things. Yes, I have my page. It's displaying correctly. However, it does not show my list. You might say, well, why doesn't it show my list? Well, that's because we need what's known as a list item, something that's going to be inside my list. If I were to simply type in here, I need eggs and milk and a few other things, if I save this and go back to it, you're going to notice it doesn't put it in a list like you would expect. No, that's why we need the second tag, and the second tag is called the list item. And it's very simple. It's LI. LI, of course, is short for list item. And so here we have our list item, and I can now put in eggs. I'll type in milk. And now if I come over here to my browser, you'll notice that it puts a little bullet point. And that little bullet point has given the unordered list the unofficial name of a bulleted list. Okay. Technically in HTML, we call it unordered. Most people that aren't technical or aren't familiar with the web are just going to call it a bullet list or a bulleted list. Now, there's a couple of really interesting things I want to show you. First is, notice I have an opening LI tag here, and then I have eggs. But notice I did not put a closing LI tag. Well, the HTML5 specification says we don't have to have that closing tag. It's not required. What is required is that we have the next opening tag, and the web browser is smart enough to say, hey, you know what? If I have an LI tag and I have another LI tag, then it's probably the next bullet point. And so it automatically puts the next bullet point. Now, you'll also notice, secondly, that when I was typing the second list item tag, Visual Studio Code automatically created the closing tag. And a lot of people like that closing tab because they like that matched set. Okay. So there's nothing wrong with leaving it, but you will find that most people do put the closing one either because they're using a tool that does it for them, like Visual Studio Code, or they just feel a little bit more comfortable. Remember, if we open something, we should close it. And it used to be in HTML, especially with XHTML, every tag that opened closed. So this is another example of that. Now, what happens if I were to have list and I want to have a sublist? Well, let's show you real quick. I'm going to take out my 2 list items and start from scratch. This way I have an open and closing list item tag for everything. And let's say, we're going to talk about things that we need to use in order to build a little cabinet or some other thing that you might find. And so you're going to say, okay, we need a hammer, we need a screwdriver, and we're going to have a list of screws. But you know what? We're going to say there's more than one type of screw. And so we're going to want to list those out separately. Now I could say screws and then put like screw, a number 8, screw, a number 10, screw. Okay, I could do that, but instead I'm going to create an unordered list inside of that list item. So notice it shows a list item and then I have the unordered list. Here I'm going to create new list items, and because these list items are within the unordered list, that's nested within the list item inside the unordered list, these are going to be nested, and we're going to see what the browser does in just a second. So I have a couple of different values like that. I reload it, and notice that you see that it automatically indents the nested list. Makes it nice and easy for us, right? Okay, so it's taken us, it's moved us indented. It also inside of Chrome is giving us a different design for our nested list. So instead of being a solid bullet point, it's now what they refer to as the circle, which is sometimes referred to as an open bullet point. Sometimes people just call it a circle. We're going to find out in HTML5 it's called a circle. How do I know it's called a circle? Well, when we go to style our bullet points, we get this as an option. Let's take a look and I'll show you. So I'm going to come back here to my styles.css. I'm going to do UL, LI, so this is my list items underneath an unordered list. If I specify list style, colon, you can see a list of other potential values I have. Now, some of these make obvious sense. For example, circle and disk. Disk is that solid bullet. You're going to see other things like square. And those all make sense for a bullet list. Well, what about those things that you might see there, like lower alpha, lower Latin, upper alpha, things like that? Well, those are for our order list, and we're going to see that in just 1 second. But I'm going to specify square real quick, just so I can show you the difference. Going to save. And when I reload, notice that now both of my lists are squares. They're solid squares. Okay. Now the reason for that is because it said any list item under an unordered list. Well, it doesn't matter if it's an unordered list inside an unordered list. It gets that style. So how do we fix it for just one of those? Well, let me show you. We're going to come back here. I'm going to say UL, UL, LI. That means an unordered list within an unordered list. So having those 2 ULs means that I have to be nested. Now, it doesn't matter if I'm nested 3 deep, 4 deep, 12 deep, 1 deep. Doesn't matter. This is all going to get this rule. In some more advanced CSS, you can learn how to be a little bit more specific. So 1 deep is handled differently than 2 deep, which is different than 3 deep, etc. Now, if I reload and you look at it closer, you'll see that my outer or my first level unordered list is a solid disk, and the inner ones are solid squares. Okay. Now, with my CSS rules, I can also change my font size, my background color, a wide variety of things. I do want to show you one quick rule because I think it's important to see so you better understand the list item versus the list. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to change the background color, and we're just going to make it kind of a light gray, just enough so it's visible. Notice how I reload the web page, you see the background color, but there's a couple things you might not notice initially. First off is our bullet point is not part of the list item. That's because by default with Chrome, and most browsers are like this, but not all, the bullet points are considered to be outside of that content area. And we can actually change that to be inside and outside with CSS, but by default it shows as outside. The other thing I want you to notice is if I come in here and I set a margin, and I'm just going to set 10 pixels. Not a lot, just enough to kind of show you what we're looking at. And I reload, notice that the space between my bullet points, because we put on the list item and not the unordered list entirely, you now see a gap there. Now, is that what you want? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Let me show you how to fix it no matter what happens if you add padding or margins or other things like that. And that's going to be, I'm just going to go UL. This compound selector is selecting the unordered list itself, the one that's inside the unordered list. So if I come over here, background color, and I'm going to move that to my unordered list, and I reload, notice it does two things. Number one, we no longer have that blank space in between our list items. So we can choose to separate out the list items, maybe make it a little bit easier to see, especially if we're going to be printing it out, so we can have a printed out checklist to check off. The second thing is my bullet points are inside of that unordered list, is just outside the list item. So now we have a background color for that as well. So just a couple of quick little things that you wanted to take notice of, and things that sometimes cause a little bit of issues when you're starting to try and style things. Because often the defaults work, but adding a little bit of extra style is very helpful. Now, remember I told you the position of the bullet point is up to you in your CSS? Well, if you want to make sure that it's not using a browser default and therefore guaranteed to be consistent, inside the list item, we can add list style position. And here we can specify either inside or outside. Now, those other things you see are a little bit more advanced. Inherit says, hey, do I have parents that I can inherit this list item rule from? Things like that. We're not going to worry about that. We're going to just change it real quick to be inside. You'll notice that it kind of pushes things just a little bit. That's because it now had to make space for that bullet point inside of the content area. So it does kind of push things in a little bit. That's the reason why by default Chrome I think uses the outside, just to make it a little bit more condensed. Now, one of the other things I do want to mention is inside the UL rule set, you can specify a rule for how many columns you want to display. Now, a lot of times I'm sure you've seen this where there's like a long list of items. Maybe it's a new computer you're looking at, it lists all the features and it lists just this long list. Maybe it's for your phone or something else. Well, I can come over here and say columns, and I can specify how many columns do I want if I give it a number. So I'm going to specify 4, for example. Now, remember, down here, I only have 2 list items. So how's it going to display 4? Well, if I come over here and I reload, notice that it kind of shows me. My margins kind of make this look a little bit weird, so we probably want to take that out. But notice it's going to display it in the amount of space that you would have as if you had 4 columns. So by default, it's 1 column, and I can go with this. Now, what happens if I specify 10 columns or 12 columns? Well, the columns is really just a hint to the browser. The browser is going to try to figure out what's the best amount of space to provide. And based upon how big a content is inside that list item, how many columns you try to specify, you'll find that it's not exact. So you might specify 6 columns and it only gives you 4, only gives you 5. Maybe it only gives you 3. Okay, and it's looking for how many items will be on the last row, how much content's in the area. you name it, it takes all these things in consideration. So it's great for providing little hints, and this is a great example of that. Like I said, we probably want to change the margin so that it's not, looking like it's uneven, but this is a good way to break things up into multiple columns. Let's take a quick look at that. Okay, so here I've got 5 items. How will the browser choose to display it? Notice that that's what it did. Because I didn't change the margins in my CSS, the first one gets pushed down and then says, you know what? I'm going to create 2 more columns, and that way I don't have just one hanging off there. And the old copywriting rules, you never want to leave a single word at the end of a line. Okay, you always want to make sure you had at least 2 words. And I think that's just what the browser is trying to do here, is trying to kind of organize this. If I come into the CSS and I say, you know what, let me take off this margin and then go back to my browser and reload, notice that now it still left me as a 3 on one and 2 on the other. It's just a little bit more organized looking. So this, like I said, is more of a hint. Yes, I asked for 4. It's doing 3 and 2. Because that's just what it's trying to do to make it look a little bit better. If I added a couple more, what would it do? Well, it might put it in 4 depending upon how big and long my content was. Completely up to the browser. So use this as a hint. You want to test things. And if you need to make sure they're consistent across different browsers, then you might need to look at making sure you're testing with them, maybe do a little bit of extra CSS, specifying how wide something is, etc. So that's our information on our unordered list. Let's look at the second most common type, which is the ordered list. To do that, I'm going to open up my template, save as, sample, and I'm going to call this my ordered. Once again, inside my main, I'm going to create just a real simple article tag. This just helps me define and organize things. And I'm going to ignore all the other text that might be involved beforehand. I'm just going to list out my individual steps. So how would I do this? Well, I'm going to say OL, and that's short for ordered list. And just like with an unordered list, I have to specify my list items. So here I will give you a list item. Now, by default, your list items start at 1 and go up in value. They are ascending in value. So I'm going to tell people the 5 things that you have to do. Step 1, do this. Step 2, do that. Step 3, then. And so a ordered list is really good for organizing those things. So here we just have a couple of list items, just very simple for you to see. Come over here to my browser, and you'll notice that it lists them 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so very, very simple. If I want to have a nested order list, maybe I have sub-steps, that's easy to do. So once again, I'm going to be inside of a list item. Then I'm going to have an ordered list. Etc., etc., as many as I need it to be. Now, if I come over here to my browser window and reload this, notice I have 1, 2, then I have 1, 2, and then I have 3. Now, a lot of people are going to say, oh, yeah, wait, what's the 3, 2? Is the 3, 2 the first 2 or the second 2? And then people go, well, what's first 2? Because it's all part of the first 2, but is it the first 2 of the inner 2 or the outer 2? And then they start having a hard time kind of trying to figure out how to describe it and how to explain it. So this is where using your CSS styles for your nested order list becomes very, very helpful. So I might want to say, you know what, I'm going to do this like I would do an English outline. Okay, so I start with my Roman numerals. And so I'm going to say list style type. I can say list style, which is a little bit of a way of concatenating a couple different things. List style type is specific to the type. And I'm going to say upper Roman, then order list, order list. So this is my order list within my order list. I'm going to say list style type, and then I'll say decimal. I'll choose lower alpha as an example. Okay, I know it's not correct in the English outline formatting, but work with me. I just want to show you the examples. Now, you might have looked at the CSS and gone, oh, wait a second, he made a mistake. He said the order list, and he didn't specify the list item under the order list. And then we show it in what? It works? Yep, it works. And so you might be going, wait a second, why is it doing that? That doesn't make sense. Well, it kind of does. The browser is smart enough to know that if you're putting a list style on an order list, or an ordered list within an ordered list, or an unordered list within an unordered list, etc., it knows that the list itself doesn't have the items, and so that's where the list item underneath that ordered list inherits from its parent what it needs to be. So it just makes defining your CSS selector just that little bit easier. Okay, and so here's our perfect example. We see with the uppercase Roman numerals first, it starts off with regular Roman numerals, 1, 2, 3. If you had 4, it would do IV. It would not do 4 I's. Okay, it's smart enough to know that. You have the number 1 and number 2 in our standard decimal format. We can also, as you saw, do upper and lowercase alphanumeric, which is the letters we're used to. And you saw some other options thrown in there as well. So this becomes very good for organizing and kind of grouping together our information we can see here. Now, the order list, you're going to notice by default is showing that it is pushed to the far right-hand side. It's right justified with our list items. We can also, if you notice when we were making our CSS styles, do a leading 0, and that's helpful. So those are just some real helpful little things that you can use for the CSS. But the order list has a couple of features that an unordered list doesn't. And that's just because of how we use it. So for example, what happens if in our list we had a list up before and then we had this long discussion, or maybe it was an article that's broken up over 2 or 3 days and we need to continue that list? Well, it would start it back at 1, as you can see, and maybe I don't want that. So I'm going to come over here, come to my sampled order, and I'm going to specify start. And what am I starting at? Well, this is the value I'm going to start at. Now, remember, my outer order list is using Roman numerals, right? So I'm starting at 9, and that's exactly what you see. So it starts at IX, which is 9 in Roman numerals, and then goes X, and then goes XI. And so we were able to start at a different value. Notice that it did not affect my inner order list, only the outer order list, because that's what I put the start to. So very, very helpful as far as that goes. Now, you might say, well, that's great, but what happens if I want to have like a top 10 list where I'm counting things down? Well, that's a great question. So if we're going to have a top 10 list, we need to start at 10. Let's just be honest here. And then I want to go in descending order. Well, there's not a descending property, but there is a reversed property. And this is a Boolean attribute. So remember we talked about Boolean attributes in our previous module. So we don't have to say reversed equals true or anything like that. All we have to do is specify reversed. If we specify this attribute, then the browser is going to know, oh wait, I'm supposed to reverse this list. And now I start with X, IX, VII. And so it started at 10 because as I said, we're going to do a top 10 list and we're counting down. And then we have IX, which is 9, and then VIII, which is 8, as you know, and it would continue through that list for however many items you had. You could have literally dozens of items if you wanted. So this becomes very helpful for us in organizing and styling our information. It's a couple of very simple attributes that you can put in, and it makes it work very, very well. If you remember those two, then you'll be very good at using your ordered and your unordered list. In your ordered and unordered list, I wouldn't be surprised if that's like 90 or 95% of all the lists on the internet. You might say, that's like a vast majority of them. I'm like, yeah, it is. It's the two of them. They're very similar. And I think the reason why you find them so often is if you're using a visual editor, whether you're using something like Dreamweaver or maybe something built into a content management system like Drupal or SharePoint or WordPress, you often will see in a rich text editor a little thing for creating bulleted and numbered list, or what we're calling unordered and ordered list. So it's like built in, it's really easy. But there's one more type of list that HTML5 gives us. And this has actually been a part of HTML for a long time. And that's called a description list. Now, it used to be called a definition list in previous versions of HTML. HTML5, they went from definition to calling it a description list. What changed? Its name. That's it. Okay? So the definition list is gone, description list is in. If you hear people either interchange those, that's the reason why. So let's look at our description list and see what's different about it. And it turns out it's actually quite a bit. I'm going to come back to my template. Change to description. Once again, add an article just for consistency. Okay, so let's talk about our description list. Well, the first thing that's a little bit different is it's DL. You might go, well, wait a second, that makes sense. UL was unordered list. OL was ordered list, so DL description list. Okay, that makes sense. So the difference is that with an unordered list and an ordered list, we had list items. In our description list, we have two tags that work together as a pair. The first is DT. This is inside of a description list, and it represents the term that we're defining or we're using. So it's often referred to as a description term, DT. And our description term can be used for a variety of things. So maybe I'm using it like a glossary. And I might specify HTML. Well, that describes a term, so our description list sounds like we need to describe something, and that would be DD, our description definition. Notice that if I come over here to my web browser and load it up, you'll see HTML. You'll notice that my DT definition term is left justified. My description definition is indented. How far is it indented? Well, let's take a look. I'm going to come over here and just grab a chunk of text. Because it's not like a list item, there's no outside wrapper, my DL can contain multiple terms and definitions. So I'm going to specify DT. Okay, so the idea here is just so we see a larger chunk of data. How does it display it? If I come back to my example, you can see that my term is still left justified and my description definition is still indented. It's enclosed. So this actually makes it good for a lot of things. Yes, I can use it for a glossary. Whether it's a glossary of terms or vocab words or whatever, this works really well. I could also use it for like an FAQ, a frequently asked questions page. So I can put the question as my term and then my definition as the answer. And of course, I can style these. So if I come over here to my style sheet, I might specify something like DT. And as my term, I want my font weight to be bold. This way it just stands out a little bit more. And I might even go so far as to give it maybe a different font. So I'll say font-family. And I'll specify a couple of options. Now, you might be going, wait a second, how come with my font family I have Gill Sans, comma, Gill Sans MT, comma, Calibri, comma, wait a second, what's with all these commas and stuff like that? Well, the web browsers know that you and other people may not have every font out there. There's literally thousands upon thousands of different fonts. And so what they do is Visual Studio Code, Dreamweaver, other visual editors, they have said, you know what, let's come up with a list of fonts that most people have. But if they don't have it, we'll do comma, and then it's kind of a failover. Well, maybe you have this one. Oh, you don't have that one? Well, maybe you have this one. You don't have that one? Well, maybe. If we give you 5 or 6 of them, surely you're going to have one of those, right? If not, notice the very last one is called sans-serif. That is whatever your browser has picked as the default font for a sans serif, that's the one you're going to get. Now, we're going to talk about the difference between serif and sans serif fonts in the future. Don't worry about that. This is just a quick example. So I'm going to come over here, reload this. Notice that the font is both thicker, bold, and you'll notice that it has a different look. That's because it's that sans serif. And right now, my description definition is in a serif font. So it's Times New Roman compared to what most people would think of as sans serif. They tend to think of like Arial or Helvetica, something like that. This is obviously not that font. It's in that same general classification, okay? So most fonts fall under the serif or the sans serif. They're two very big classifications. We'll see in a future module that there's actually several more, and we're not going to worry about that. So you can see how we can use CSS to change the way things look. We could go so far as to maybe even use a little bit of JavaScript to maybe hide answers that we don't want to show just yet. You know, you got to click on the question in order to see the answer. That's JavaScript. We're not going to deal with that. It's some of the advantages and disadvantages to having a description list which uses 2 separate tags. So the reason why it's a downside, I think that a lot of people don't use it, is simply because people are expecting to use a single list item tag. That's all they should need. Having 2 makes it a lot more difficult for any WYSIWYG editors. Remember from previous modules, we said WYSIWYG is what you see is what you get, and that type of thing. So just kind of a little FYI as far as that goes. And so those are your 3 different types of lists that you can find in HTML. And they, like I said, they have been around since previous versions of HTML. I remember using them all the way back in HTML3. I'm sure it's been longer before that. That's just kind of where I started. We're up to 5, close to 20 years later. This is a standard practice. Most are going to be the unordered list, then the ordered list, and then finally that last 5, maybe 10% of the usage is going to be the description list.